As I stumbled forward, I was racked by a violent feeling of pain and terror. It seemed I was gradually being forgotten. I felt that I would only be mentioned in passing in these Salem Witchcraft trials, about which so much would be written later. Trials that would arouse the curiosity and pity of generations to come as the greatest testimony of a superstitious and barbaric age. It would be mentioned here and there of a slave originating from the West Indies and probably practicing hoodoo. There'd be no mention of my age or my personality. I would be ignored. As early as the end of the 17th century, petitions would be circulated, judgments made, rehabilitating the victims, restoring their honor, and returning their property to their descendants. I would never be included. Tituba would be condemned forever. There would never, ever be a careful, sensitive biography recreating my life and its suffering. And I was outraged by this future injustice that seemed more cruel than even death itself. Hi everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I'm going to be talking about Moi Tituba, Noire Sorcière de Salem, or I Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, by Maryse Condé, translated by Richard Philcox. Maryse Condé is a French language author from Guadeloupe who recently in 2018 won the Nobel Alternatif, but I don't think she has quite received the recognition that I think she deserves, especially in the US. I suspect that one of these reasons is that she writes in French. But either way, her novels are very good. And I think that I Tituba specifically is very relevant for any student of early American history or anyone interested in colonialism, race, gender, etc. In this video, I want to explore some of the ways to approach this book while avoiding major spoilers, namely by exploring three different issues. One, Condé's view of revisionist history. Two, how this book sort of works as a parody of itself. And three, how it presents Tituba's witchcraft. What I hope to show is that Condé isn't simply rehabilitating this forgotten or ignored historical figure, but is completely revising history while simultaneously playing with our modern ideas about what a witch even is. I Tituba is about a woman named Tituba, or Tituba. I'll probably go back and forth between the pronunciations as I've heard it both ways. Tituba was the first woman accused in the Salem Witchcraft, in the Salem Witch Trials in the late 17th century. She was a real historical person but we know very little about her. Her deposition exists in the court records, but it simply identifies her as, quote, Tituba, a slave originating from the West Indies and probably practicing hoodoo. This is really the only historical information that we have of Tituba, but this is where Maryse Condé's genius really comes in. This book is explicitly a reimagining of Tituba, who is given a childhood in Barbados before she enters slavery and is sold to Samuel Parris, who eventually takes her to Salem, where she ends up being in the Salem Witch Trials. What's so interesting about this book is how Condé revises our conception of the Salem Witch Trials by having us view them through the eyes of Tituba, a woman of color who our history has either forgotten, if you're optimistic, or consciously ignored, if you're pessimistic like me. That is, most people in the US know about the Puritans generally, or the Salem Witch Trials specifically, and all the problems that came about because of these trials. Indeed, these trials were internationally condemned by the end of the 17th century, just a few years later. We all know about these trials because in high school, most of us, or a lot of us, have had to read either Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, or Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, which doesn't directly address the witch trials, of course, but its focus on gender and Puritan ideologies and Puritan ideas, alongside the fact that Hawthorne's great-grandfather, just grandfather, was a judge at the trial, certainly helps us understand the Puritan ideologies that led to the witch trials. Both of these works, the Crucible and the Scarlet Letter, work to rehabilitate some of the victims of the Salem witch trials and serve as an expose of the ridiculousness of puritanical ideologies. But as the quote I read at the start explains, these works more or less ignore Tituba. That is, the white women are rehabilitated while the woman of color is left to be forgotten. As I noted earlier, Condé's work revises this history. She invents a childhood for Tituba, which allows her to discuss much larger issues of colonialism in the 17th century. But more importantly, it allows her to connect these issues with post-colonialism in the 20th century, in the 1980s, when she's writing this book. The opening lines of this book read, "Aimé, my mother, was raped by an English sailor on the deck of Christ the King one day in the year 16, while the ship was sailing for Barbados. I was born from this act of aggression, from this act of hatred and contempt." From the opening lines, we immediately see Condé's preoccupation with imperialism and colonialism and the violence that comes along with it. We see this act of sexual violence happening on a boat called Christ the King, bringing in ideas of Christianity itself being one of the most important and powerful tools of imperialism and colonialism, as well as bringing up images of the atrocities that happened on the Middle Passage, of course, as this event is happening on a boat. As a native to Guadeloupe, Condé is obviously hyper-aware of the lasting repercussions of colonialism, and this book takes up this very post-colonialist perspective. This book is unapologetically revisionist history, and I want to take a second and talk about that term a little bit, as I think it's a really scary idea for a lot of people who like to think that history is objective and only fact-based, whereas art and literature is where people can express their feelings and opinions and ideas. But of course, anyone who has read a lot of history and has studied historiography, that is the study of history, knows that history, while usually mostly based on what we consider to be facts, is constructed into narratives by people. And of course, these people have agendas, personal biases, political persuasions, etc. That is, the study of history is by definition subjective, not objective, as it's written by people. Obviously, history does deal with facts and historical truths, but it's necessary to revise the way that we approach these facts and truths as we understand more and more about the effects of imperialism and colonialism on history writing. This is all to say that revisionist history is a good thing. Revising is a good thing. Revision simply means to see again or to correct, right? Tituba does just that. It replaces Tituba back into the story that she was kicked out of, and by doing this, Condé replaces colonized people back into the center, where they belong, of the history of early America. One of perhaps the most interesting ways that Condé does this is by having Tituba have a very long and very interesting discussion with none other than Hester Prynne, the protagonist of Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. I won't get into too many spoilers here, but they have a fascinating discussion about feminism and the intersection and the intersectional relationship between gender, sexuality, and race, with the references to other feminists like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, among others. It's a really interesting moment in the book with a lot of nuanced discussion going on. If revising history to make room for Tituba was all this book did, it would be a perfectly commendable book that explores the colonial history of the New World. And in fact, this seems to be what a lot of early readers thought this book was, just based on the scholarship and what was written about it in the early 90s. However, this book, I argue, is not that straightforward. What Condé is doing is way more complicated than just rehabilitating Tituba. This book is not a careful and sensitive biography that Tituba, in the quote that began this video, explains will never exist. This is the great trick or trap of this book. This book is a parody of itself in many ways and plays with our perceptions of what a black woman from Guadeloupe would do given the chance to recreate Tituba. This book is postmodern to its core. Apparently, Maryse Condé didn't actually decide to write about Tituba by herself. Her publisher, a certain Madame Gaimard, asked Conde to write a story about a young woman from the Caribbean. That is, a white woman asked a black woman to tell her a story. This is a reoccurring motif in the book. And Conde does just that. She tells her publisher a story. This edition is so interesting because it includes both a foreword by Angela Davis, the formidable academic and political activist, and an afterword by Anne Armstrong Scarborough, another academic. What's fascinating about both the foreword and the afterword is that both Davis and Scarborough take this novel very seriously. They both seem to misread this book as only a serious work. It seems that they both fell into Condé's trap. Indeed, in the afterword, there's a really interesting interview between Scarborough and Conde, and Scarborough keeps asking really good and really serious questions about the work, concerning imperialism, race, gender, slavery, all this different stuff. And at one point, Conde, seemingly exasperated by Scarborough's questioning, just says, quote, "I repeat that the element of parody is very important if you wish to fully understand Tituba. Parts of this book are deliberately overdrawn. Do not take Tituba too seriously, please." Throughout this book, Conde plays with not only histories, but our modern ideas of witchcraft, gender, sexuality, and race. Indeed, this book mocks white feminism, critiquing the dominant academic form of feminism that were being circulated in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Conde isn't just playing with history, she's playing with us. This is Tituba's revenge, and this is Maryse Condé's genius. In this book, you're never really quite sure if you're dealing with a cliche stereotype, a parody, or another sort of narrative trick, or if she's being sincere. It's difficult to put your finger on Tituba, as her witchcraft is both real and unreal. Tituba's witchcraft is a very important part of this book, obviously, as the idea of a witch is central to both feminist and colonialist history. Throughout Western history, women have been accused of witchcraft. These accusations were often associated with the church, who saw heresy everywhere they decided to look. But this problem extends and expands quite a bit in the colonial world, to not just have a gender dynamic, but to have a racial dynamic as well. Things like voodoo, traditionally practiced in West Africa and later in the Caribbean by West African descendants, get thrown into these Western pejorative views of witchcraft. And I should be clear that the prosecution of witchcraft isn't just, and of witches, isn't just a colonial problem, by the way. I'm just kind of focusing on it here. Women the world over have been and still are accused and persecuted as witches. I recently actually watched the 2018 film I Am Not a Witch, directed by Rungano Nyani, which is a really interesting look at the issue of how they treat women who the government deems witches in modern day Zambia. But let's look at Tituba's witchcraft specifically, as we get a pretty detailed description of what kinds of witchcraft, what sorts of witchcraft she's taught in the very first chapter. After something very spoiler-free happens to Tituba's mother, Tituba is taken in by an old woman named Mama Yaya. Mama Yaya is the one who teaches Tituba witchcraft, and she really takes up this role, kind of a stereotypical role of the wise old woman who teaches our young protagonist. We get some really interesting and really specific things that Mama Yaya teaches her. She teaches Tituba how to communicate with the dead, which we see Tituba do throughout the book as she conjures up various dead characters. She's also taught, quote, how to change myself into a bird on a branch, into an insect in the dry grass, or a frog croaking in the mud of the river Ormond whenever I was tired of the shape I had been given at birth. Curiously, we never see Tituba do this, though it seems like it would be quite useful on more than one occasion. And finally, we get this passage. Quote, Mama Yaya put the finishing touches to her lesson about herbs. Under her guidance, I attempted bold hybrids, crossbreeding the passiflorinde with the Prynne torrée, the poisonous palme citaire with the suret, and the azalea des azalées with the persifleurs. I devised drugs and potions whose powers I strengthened with incantations. This is all very specific and sounds like the kind of things that a witch doctor would do, but are these herbal crossbreedings real? That is, what do you get when you crossbreed a passiflorinde with a Prynne torrée? In fact, what are these things that are being crossbreeded? Passiflorinde almost sounds like the French word for a passiflora or a passion flower, but it's not quite right. And a Prynne torrée, a plum taurus. Luckily for us, this book has a glossary where if we look up these words, we see that they are, quote, a literary invention by the author. Further, the palme citaire that we were just told is poisonous, well, we learn that it is not poisonous, as the author suggests. So what's going on here? Well, it seems that either Conde had no interest in doing research on herbal medicine, or she decided that she just wanted to make stuff up. I think she's just playing with us here. Tituba's witchcraft is real, but it's like the most stereotypical kind of witchcraft you could get, as she's mixing and matching various herbs and plants in a cauldron and threatening to turn into frogs in the mud or birds on the branches. That is, Tituba seems to be performing for us as much as Conde is performing for her publisher. Tituba is the embodiment of the preconceptions that we, who have a certain idea of what witches are, expect her to be. And isn't that just exactly what a witch is? Are we that different from the people of Salem who accused her of being a witch? Don't they also put their preconceptions of what a witch is onto her? In fact, when asked if she is a witch, Tituba eloquently explains, everyone gives that word a different meaning. Everyone believes he can fashion a witch to his way of thinking so that she will satisfy his ambitions, dreams, and desires. Ituba is a stellar book that is as much about the late 20th century as it is about the 17th. It's more interested, I think, in modern ideas of feminism, race, and postcolonialism than it is about how the Puritans scapegoated their own deepest fears onto a bunch of vulnerable women. It's a very intertextual book as well. I think if you've read The Scarlet Letter, you'll love the conversations and the interactions between Tituba and Hester, as it conjures up Hester's voice, that is, a fictional 17th century white woman created by a 19th century upper-class white male, and puts into conversation with Tituba, a 17th century black woman who is recreated by a 20th century Guadeloupe woman. It's a really fascinating and nuanced book that is, surprisingly given the subject matter, an absolute joy to read. It's playful and fun and funny alongside it being incredibly sad and frustrating. However, as much as I think we are meant to feel those latter emotions, I don't think we should lose sight of the former ones. If we lose sight of how playful and mocking this book is, I think we might miss part of the point. Let me know what you think of Ituba in the comments below. I really look forward to having a conversation. Thank you for watching.